everyone, and welcome to another episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to continue our two-part series on the impeachment of Andrew Johnson by looking at the life and work of Edmund Ross. Chris, I'm really excited about this guy because, he's someone that played a very important role in the impeachment of the president of the United States. But yet a lot of people don't know anything about him.
Yeah, actually, one historian was writing about Edmund Ross, and in 1868, he's been called the most heroic act in American history. It was more difficult than any act of valor upon the field of battle. Yet nobody knows his name. And this guy, Edmund Ross from Kansas, born in Ohio, but will become very influential in a key moment in American history that still speaks today about partisanship and even how individuals within the same party don't necessarily see eye to eye.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a man who was under great pressure, as we're going to see today, to to fall in line, sort of do what he was told to do what he was supposed to do. But he said, you know what, I'm going to do what I think is the right thing to do, even if it angers a lot of people in my party. And he did, and it certainly did, because as we're going to see, he ended his life ostracized from many of his friends and people he had been close to in the years before. So, Chris, I'm going to, take a moment to sort of review where we were last time for those who didn't tune in the last podcast on the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Of course, Andrew Johnson was president of the United States following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in April of 1865. Coming into office, of course, he's got the unenviable task of trying to pull the nation back together and do reconstruction. And he tries to really do it his own way and angers a lot of people in Congress who are on recess at that time. They come back, and there's a lot of push and pull between the president and with Congress. And of course, he tries to fire at least one person in his cabinet, trying to sort of clear the deck of people he didn't agree with or who didn't agree with him. Congress passes a law called the Tenure of Office Act. And Chris, that was something that Andrew Johnson could not let go. Being told that he was not allowed to fire a cabinet member who had been approved by the Senate, he was not going to be able to let that go.
Hard for people to understand something like that in 2020, isn't it? A president being told that he can't do something and finding every which way that he can to make that happen. Unfortunately, we still see that history does sometimes repeat itself. And then that kind of sets the stage for Edmund Ross to kind of come in. Edmund Ross was born in Ohio and was very involved in the print industry. And, he in a Democrat Party family, and he opposed slavery. And one of his first, I guess, heroic acts, if you will, really is hidden. And that is something that took place while he was in Wisconsin. He was working with newspapers, and he heard the story of this guy whose name was Joshua Glover. And Joshua Glover was an escaped slave who had made his way to Wisconsin. He had been captured in Wisconsin, so they had held him at the local jail, waiting to send him back to his slave owners. And at that moment, Edmund Ross organized a group of people to break into the jail. They freed Glover and basically allowed Glover to escape into Canada. And it was at that moment that Ross really identified with this anti-slavery leanings, and it caused him to join the Republican Party. He'll then move to Topeka, Kansas, and he'll join that band of anti-slavery immigrants. And, this is one of those moments right before the Civil War where we hear this topic or this theme that's called Bleeding Kansas, where these individuals are rushing in who are anti-slavery to fight literally against slavery supporters in Kansas to try to determine whether or not Kansas becomes a free state or it becomes an enslaved state. So after the war, Edmund Ross is returning home to Kansas. He's becoming more involved in politics. And at the time, he's a no-name, not interested in politics, just strongly supports anti-slavery movement. but he becomes very irritated with the current senator in Kansas, whose name was Jim Lane. Jim Lane was a conservative Republican. He supported Johnson's plan to carry out Lincoln's Reconstruction policies. And this really upset Edmund Ross. And he was so upset that what he decided to do was to organize this riot, this protest, this gathered a group of people in Lawrence, Kansas. They hung him in effigy. They basically called Jim Lane names. I mean, they were just really cruel to this guy. And what happens is, because of their cruelty, this attack on Senator Lane ultimately caused him to have health problems. He had mental, emotional, and social problems because of this. And it caused so much stress on Lane's life that he would ultimately take his own life, which now opens up the senator position in Kansas. And so before Ross gets into the Senate and becomes a viable candidate, I think, Ray, it's important to talk about the radical Republicans. I know we mentioned them the other day in our podcast, but maybe just give the listeners just a quick reminder about just how upset these radical Republicans were at Andrew Johnson and maybe at the Reconstruction policies.
Absolutely. I mean, these people, to understand who the Republicans were at this time, there was basically two groups. There were your more moderate Republicans and your radical Republicans. And both groups generally were anti-slavery. But of course, the radical Republicans not just simply wanted to see the abolition of slavery, they wanted to see certain political rights given to the freedmen, the now former slaves. Andrew Johnson, when he comes in, and while Congress is on recess, remember we talked earlier about the fact that he sort of tries to control Reconstruction, do Reconstruction his own way. One of the things he does is, of course, he starts offering very lenient pardons and other things to the Southern states and to the former Confederate generals and people like that. So he starts being far more lenient with the former Confederacy and its leaders than most, if not all, of the radical Republicans were interested in doing. They wanted to punish the South.
Yeah, not only did they want to punish the South, but they wanted to punish Andrew Johnson, the
Absolutely.
current president of the United States. And they were focused only on getting rid of Andrew Johnson, and they would do whatever it took. Whether it was legal or even illegal, it didn't matter to them. But their ultimate purpose was not passing legislation. It was impeaching and convicting the president of the United States, Andrew Johnson. And to do that, they knew they had to have a solid consensus of radical Republicans that would toe the line, that would all be in agreement that Andrew Johnson must go. And so as Jim Lane kills himself, they begin looking for a replacement, and they immediately draw their attention to this guy called Edmund Ross. And Edmund has no political experience, but they say, man, did you see what he did in Lawrence, Kansas? Did you see how he got a group of people together who were, really supportive of what Ross was saying, and they were against Lane? And so they started thinking, hey, this guy, he might be really, really good for us. So they make it happen, and Edmund Ross becomes the senator from Kansas. And Ross publicly states that he thought that what Johnson was doing was wrong, that he didn't like Johnson, he didn't like his policies. And so then comes time of impeachment in the House. And after they impeach Johnson, the Senate is now going to take up the trial. And things are still looking really good for the radical Republicans. But then Edmund Ross makes a statement. And he says, I want you to know, I don't like President Johnson. He said, I don't like his policies. I don't like anything about the guy. But he deserves to have a fair trial, just as any other accused person does on this earth. And he said, so all I'm going to do is allow this guy to be given a fair trial. And when he said those words, some in the radical Republican Party, his own party, began to question his motives and began to think, this guy might not be 100% with us. Mm-hmm. And Ray, I tell you, it's scary. Some of the things that happened during the trial, and we talked about the trial in the previous episode, but how the radical Republicans spied on their own people, how they pressured their own guys to make sure that, hey, you need to toe the line. The goal in this trial is he must be convicted.
That is all that we're doing. Nothing else matters. And we need to make sure that you're going to say, yes, I want to find him guilty. It was so bad that General Stanton, remember, he's the Secretary of War, barricaded in his office because he said, the president's not going to fire me. And he sent a general to watch over Edmund Ross, just to let him know, hey, if you don't follow the line of the party, something could happen to you. Ross's brother, it is told, was offered $20,000 if he would help change the vote of Edmund Ross to make sure that he was going to be a yes man. So there's some crazy stuff that's going on during this time period. But what I love about Edmund Ross is he was willing to take an oath to establish impartial justice, to follow the Constitution. And he said, I'm just going to be honest. I'm going in there and I'm going to vote my conscience. I'm going to do what is right, not for the Republican Party and not even for myself, but I'm going to do what's right in the eyes of the land, in the eyes of the country. It's pretty noble of what he's going to do. Now, Ray, do you remember how many senators were there in the Senate at this particular time?
At this time, I believe there was 54, I believe. At least
Yeah.
54 were present on the day that they voted on whether to convict Johnson.
And so you got to have 36
right
to convict Andrew Johnson. And they're really kind of focusing on what's happening and how things are going to go. And it's interesting that before the vote takes place in the Senate chambers, 10 minutes before Ross is scheduled to give his vote, and nobody knows how he's going to vote. They all just assume the guy's going to toe the line and he's going to say, convict the guy. That's what everybody's thinking. But 10 minutes before the vote, his own people in his party come up to him and they say, just a reminder, if you let Andrew Johnson get away with this, we will trump up charges on you. We will destroy you politically, financially, and even your family, and we will send you to your political grave. That was 10 minutes before the guy was to give the impartial vote that he said that he was going to do, because Johnson deserved a fair trial. And, it's interesting, 24 people had already gone before him. 24 had already said guilty. They knew they had 10 more that were certain to say guilty. And so it basically comes down to this guy, Edmund Ross, not well known, doesn't have a lot of political favor, a lot of political influence. But this guy from Kansas steps up and he says, as every eye looked his way, this freshman senator rose to his feet and he said, Andrew Johnson is not guilty. And Ray, can you imagine the courage it must have taken to go against your party and to vote on your morals?
This took an awful lot of courage that he had, because he knew what he was doing. Like you said, they had made very clear what they were going to do if he didn't toe the line. And, he's the reason Johnson was able to stay in office. So, he knew what he was doing when he stood up and said, not guilty. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was ending his political career and, for all intents and purposes, many of his social connections as well.
Yeah. And it's interesting. The backlash was immediate and it was powerful against Edmund Ross. The Potawatomi Gazette said this. They said, compared with Ross, Judas was a saint and Benedict Arnold was a patriot. He had other people that came up and they burned his effigy in front of the Capitol in Topeka, Kansas. Even one of the judges in Lawrence, Kansas sent Ross a telegram and said this. They said, hey, the rope with which Judas hung himself is undoubtedly lost, but the pistol with which Senator Jim Lane blew out his brains can possibly be found. It is amazing to me that here is a man who 10 minutes before he gave the vote of his life, they were pressuring him. They were reminding him that he was digging himself a political grave if he went against them. And yet here's what this man does. one vote, one person, and it not only changes the course of history, but it also changes the course of this man's history. He would never be reelected to the Senate. His family would experience social ostracism, physical attacks, poverty. And I just can't help but think that here we have an individual who was more interested in losing his career than losing a country, because he would vote for what other people wanted instead of what was right. I wonder if we have politicians today who would demonstrate extraordinary profiles of courage and would be able to stand up today and maybe do something like Edmund Ross.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to know if we had people like that, because I think we mentioned last episode, I just mentioned it a few minutes ago. Edmund Ross was the reason Johnson stayed in office. It was 35-19. If he had voted yay, Johnson would not only have been the first president of the United States to be impeached, he would have been the first and only president to have been removed from office through conviction.
Yeah, and he does the right thing, but he does lose everything.
Yeah.
And I think that there's just a testimony right there to a person who is willing to stand on their morals, who is willing to stand up for what is right. And, Ross eventually moves to New Mexico. And as he was in his latter years and actually getting ready to leave this earth, I do find it interesting that many who had been so hard against him, who had really brought about just enormous strain on his family, that they actually years later came back and said, he saved the country.
Yeah.
This guy was willing to stand up against an unruly mob. So while he lost everything, at least at the end, there were a few people who said, we were wrong and he was right because he saved the country.
Yeah. And I think history has proven him right as well. I mean, you certainly don't want presidents to be able to remove from office just simply because, for political reasons, even though, as we said in the last episode, every impeachment's political. Whether you look at the impeachment of Johnson, Clinton, or Trump, they all are political at the end of the day. But you want to make sure that there's legitimate reason, there's actual high crimes and misdemeanors there, and not just a political bone somebody wants to pick. But you know what? Almost 60 years, Chris, after the 1868 impeachment of Andrew Johnson, almost 60 years after Edmund Ross stood up and gave that fateful vote, the United States Supreme Court in Myers versus the United States actually, I guess you could say, vindicated Edmund Ross. There was a case that came up in which President Woodrow Wilson had removed a postmaster here in the United States, obviously, without seeking Senate approval. Of course, the postmaster, I guess he had to be approved by the Senate. And the Supreme Court in 1926 argued that to deny, and I'm quoting here, to deny the president that power would not allow him to discharge his own constitutional duty of seeking that the laws be faithfully executed. So in other words, the Tenure of Office Act, they argued in 1926, was unconstitutional. So ultimately Myers was right. I mean, not Myers, ultimately Ross was right that this was not something that the president should be removed for doing.
And Ross does not have a single law that's to his name. There's not a single wall of fame, if you will, in the rotunda in the Capitol that bears the miraculous work of Ross. He dug himself in a political grave. But if there's one thing that can be said based on the vindication of the Supreme Court case, based on what people later on in the year said, I think his tombstone can say today that while here lies the death of Edmund Ross and his political career, what rises up from this is the legacy of always standing up for your morals, of standing up for your values, and that if you always do what's right, you will always be vindicated at the end. And that, for me, was one of the fascinating stories of Edmund Ross, someone who is long forgotten, maybe in the annals of history, but who should always be at the forefront of our minds and our hearts when we're asked to do something that might challenge the status quo.
Yeah, definitely a role model. Role model for political leaders, for corporate leaders, a role model for family leaders. He's a man who was willing to risk everything to stand up for what he believed was the right thing to do. Chris, this has been an absolutely fascinating episode. I have really loved learning more about Edmund Ross and having the opportunity to review this most historical event in American history, the first president to be impeached by the House of Representatives, Andrew Johnson. And I know, Chris, in the weeks and months to come, we have a lot of different topics we're going to be discussing here on the podcast. I think our listeners will find a lot of the stuff we're going to be doing in 2021 very, very fascinating. And I'm looking forward to learning a lot of new information as we move forward about history you didn't know.
Yeah, it's hard to believe we've done several episodes. I encourage our listeners to go back, because really within our episodes, you can find a lot of different avenues that we go down. There are things that we discuss that we just really want to talk about, we want to learn about. And I know that our listeners have ideas and stories that they'd like for us to maybe talk about. So I would encourage them to reach out to us. I know that you'll share with them how they can reach out to us, but also we want to encourage them to pass this podcast along to others. Share with them the many different ways that we can be found out there in the world of podcasts.
History You Didn't Know But Should can be heard on Sounder FM, Spotify, and Google Podcast. To contact us, you can send us an email at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. See you next time.